Welcome back to another episode of Focus State. I am, again, joined by my lovely colleague, Modestus. Welcome, Modestus.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Of course. It went so well the last time. We have, today, we're talking about technical debt. And I believe I phrased it in the description of this episode. What I wanted to have a conversation about was the startup killing technical debt. As in, it's one of the things that we see often and hear a lot about, kind of at least from a resource perspective, can have a huge effect on the growth and the livability of a startup, especially early on. And I want to have a conversation with you. You as a product designer has a big effect on that topic. For the people out there, in terms of how we define technical debt, can you put some words on how you kind of think about technical debt?
Sure. So to put it simply, technical debt is usually occurs when we cut corners in the product development process. So I always think about it as, like a good analogy for that is, when you go to the bank, right? And you want to buy something now, you'll borrow some money. And you make that decision consciously, right? Mm. So that's how more or less like intentional technical debt works.
Okay.
So we cut corners in order to release something faster, even though we know that it's going to cost us some money, some resources in the future.
Right.
The return and the benefit of it is eventually going to be worth it, right?
Right.
Hopefully. Another side of it, a little bit, scarier side of it, when the technical debt occurs unintentionally. So imagine, I don't know, like we hired 3 new developers, right? Mm. They're junior developers. We left them unattended. Chances are we're going to end up with some poorly written code, at least some parts of it, right?
Sure.
And that's how usually unintentionally, that's how we accumulate technical debt.
Makes
intentionally.
Sense. Makes sense.
Pardon me for the phrasing.
That's okay. So how do you then, if you want to balance moving fast, as most startups probably want to, and then at the same time laying this foundation to kind of help you like succeed in the future, both in terms of the development and design side of things, mostly the design side of things. How do you make that balance? How do you make sure you have both things?
Well, I think we speak about it here a lot, here as EDL. I think it's important not to reinvent the wheel and just use the resources that are already out there available for us. And a good example would be, I don't know, picking a nice component library that works with, usually they work with all the major frameworks out there, right? And it could be Material UI, it could be Chakra UI, whatever it is, as long as that library has a nice track record of a component support, something that is just, you could easily update it through NPM. So getting that right, picking a nice library that already has nicely written code and obviously, components, accessible components. I think it's going to help a lot for the early stage startups.
Yeah, that makes sense. And is there anything in terms of finding that? We talked about it this morning, actually, because of another project we're working on with. We do a lot of custom, in general, a lot of custom design. It's not really necessarily based on anything. And you were the one mentioning that, well, the client we're working with mentioned that, are we using any component libraries, anything out of the box that developers can kind of cling to and speed up their process? And we didn't necessarily. And you mentioned something in terms of maybe even modifying the UI design like we've made so far to kind of accommodate for that, for the developers to be able to move more efficiently, which is very interesting. And we started looking into searching and looking at Tailwind or React libraries, as you mentioned too. it's a great place to start. Going into GitHub or something, see if you can find something that works very well and fits with your design philosophy.
Definitely. And I mean, the reason is that a lot of these UI libraries already have documentation straight out of the box, right?
Absolutely.
Already have like, I don't know, layout presets for you.
Yeah.
You can choose from too, you know, they are very flexible. So they have a lot out of the box.
Yeah.
And you can pick and choose whatever you want.
Absolutely.
And they're also like, if it's a good UI library, it'll also allow you to make styling changes. So
right.
It's pretty flexible in terms of that. It's just a matter of picking something that you know that is going to be supported in the future.
Yeah.
That is, you know, future proof, and something that just works within your tech stack.
Exactly.
Essentially.
Yeah, the tech stack. Yeah, absolutely. And also, you mentioned the styles and everything. Nowadays, at least most of the UI kits that we look at, or at least the most popular ones, also have a Figma file, and that doesn't necessarily go without saying that they do. But that also, if you have a designer or you are a bit savvy in Figma, for example, you're able to move quickly alongside the development and have some sort of relationship one-to-one, which is also part of the technical debt part.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. The UI kit too, because most of the times they're being like, you have those available too.
Exactly.
If you're like looking for some front-end UI library, you also have UI kit for Figma, let's say, or any other design platforms.
Exactly, it's a huge benefit.
Definitely.
I think that's enough about UI kits. But UI kits is really it's not cheat code, but especially initially finding something that just works, and something. Most of them also have like a community around them, like these. As you mentioned, like you find something on GitHub or anywhere really, there's a community that supports it and builds on it and fixes boxes or fix bugs or makes everything accessible code-wise, design-wise, everything.
Yeah, I think it's a great choice for those companies that don't necessarily have experienced in-house designers, right? Because you have a lot of things documented within the UI kit ready for you,
right?
And you can just use that straight out of the box.
Exactly.
And by using that kit, right, as a designer, and then having developers use the same UI library, kind of helps you to bridge that gap between code and design.
Absolutely, huge benefits. Huge benefits when we talk eliminating that technical debt. How can I wrote down a very lengthy question, very difficult to read from this far away question. In terms of like, how can a startup use design in the development process to avoid technical debt proactively instead of just like doing it later on, like saving it for later or revisiting it, which, if we're being honest, in most cases doesn't happen. We're just building on top of the technical debt as the platform progresses and evolves.
Yeah, well, I think you always had a good point by mentioning that we should always start from the design, and then once we know the specs and once we're all kind of aligned in terms of how the flow should work, and we can kind of jump into the code or development process, right?
Yeah.
So not leaving out the design, and starting from the design.
Yeah.
I think it's very important because, again, it's way cheaper, first of all, to make design adjustments rather than, rewriting code.
Yes.
And it's also makes it faster for you to, ideate and explore different ideas. And I think that's an important part, just starting off from design.
Yeah.
Before you jump into like building on top of existing feature,
right.
You should still go back to your Figma files and, start there.
Exactly.
As opposed to just go and do code rewrites.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So get that initial alignment in something as cheap as Figma, as opposed to code, as you say. Coding is it's very difficult in terms of the complexity and managing that code in the future. It becomes more and more complex the more you just add or remove a bit or rewrite something just based on whatever, a conversation at the coffee machine. Having all of that in Figma is way quicker.
Definitely.
Way easier.
Definitely. And a second kind of, like, that was the first part of it. And the second part of it would be just, taking the documentation seriously when you design something.
Yes.
Of course, communication is important, but it really helps the developers to have some annotations, right?
Yeah, in Figma, yeah.
Yeah. And it could be as simply as, explaining how the layout should behave on a bigger screen. If you if you set a container to fail, I don't know. And if you have a max width on it, make sure to communicate that.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's an excellent point, because we see that quite a lot with the responsiveness. And
we designers tend to leave that out,
right,
to developers way too often.
Yes. And sometimes it's just obvious for us as designers. Like, of course, this stops scaling at this point, but it's not obvious when you're sitting and looking at static Figma.
No. And I also think that sometimes you don't have to annotate everything.
Sure.
But as long as, I don't know, like in Figma, you've added max width.
Yeah.
Developers will be able to inspect and see that property in there.
Yeah. See the intention.
So just, clearly structuring things in there is very important. And then annotating interaction design.
More so. Yeah, more
that's
important.
Very important. Like annotating how the application should behave, right?
Right.
In different scenarios.
Yeah.
That helps. And it's a good reference point, because a lot of the times we have these conversations with developers, but those conversations are, we might forget about it a couple of days after, because it's just get lost somewhere in a Slack thread or in a long email thread, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Having a nice reference point, is always helpful.
That always helps. And I think we also, at some point, talked a bit about the whole communication is important, as you mentioned, in terms of the development team, or just for the sake of this startup perspective. Let's say you have a full stack or a front-end developer and you have a single designer, having that communication, as you say, continuously. And if you have a very visual person and a less visual person, having those two communicate, and let's say the developer is very practical, so you will have that continuous communication internally. It's so important to kind of facilitate that space. We've seen that so many times that if it's not encouraged to have these discussions, the developers will just do as they please or do as they see fit with the design they've been giving without asking any questions. And likewise, design will just design something new that we haven't used before, so extra resources. Yeah. And if resources is tight, it creates complication, and then things just happen in the code and technical debt. And yeah.
It's never nice.
It's a slippery slope. Okay. Communication is important. I think we already knew that, but it goes without saying, especially in startups. When we talk with a lot of different startups, and we're able to, just based on the communication or understanding where they are right now or seeing the platform, just simply clicking around, we're able to kind of sniff out any issues that might be. And also in terms of technical debt, is there any general warning signs you see as a designer, as a product designer, when we talk technical debt? Is there anything that kind of, hey, this there might be something off here that we need to have a look at?
Well, sometimes just straight up looking at the platform would be difficult to determine, right? Or to see the red flags. But if you were to look at the design files, right, and you suddenly start to see misalignment between what was spec'd, right, and what we have in reality. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good indication that, the startup is actively accumulating technical debt. Because what usually happens is that, product managers, they spec the feature, right, and then designers design it based on the spec. And then somewhere after that step, within the process, something bad happens,
Yes.
and then we end up with a lesser feature, right?
Yeah.
Poorly, I don't know, implemented feature.
Right.
So I think that's one indication, one of the red flags. It's always like, in my opinion, it's also like the more you talk to them, the more you get to know how they work internally.
The developers or the team?
The team in
The
general.
whole team. Yeah.
The whole team, because it's a cultural thing.
Absolutely.
The easier it is to see whether it's a problem or not. Because if you have this culture of, okay, let's build it now and we'll fix it later, yeah, well, it's a big red flag.
Yeah.
And it's a very common thing in the startup environment.
Sure.
Because, well, they have this pressure to raise money, right?
Yeah.
And maybe especially with startups that are chasing enterprise clients, happens a lot because they ask, potential client might ask for a feature.
Sure.
And there's a deadline.
Yeah.
Right. And you need to get there no matter what.
Right.
You need to provide some sort of value to them.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're not going to be your client. And for some startup, it's life or death question.
Yeah, that's true.
Life or death matter.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with the enterprise game in general, where they often also provide the money in those cases, like the customers for the startups. Like, if you build this, we'll pay for you to build this for us in your platform, and then that's just another incentive to not really think twice, maybe, or trying to understand how can we have this feature or kind of fix this pain point for a client, but at the same time kind of maybe ask 2 other clients and trying to figure out a solution that fits for everybody. So we don't start bloating our platform with features or code that could be better, could be optimized, could be less of few lines of code. But yes, that's a great point. And that we'll refine later is a classic.
And it's fine,
sure,
as long as, again, we're mindful that there is a backlog piling up.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of cases, some product managers might not even want to hear that, right?
Sure.
So I think it's a cultural thing.
Sure.
Right.
Definitely. And we've seen the opposite side of that, as you mentioned, that just having a backlog is also just fine. Like, sometimes we actually get back to it later as long as there is some sort of cultural understanding of we'll wait till vacation, like summer vacation, to fix all of these things.
Of course.
Because we have the time.
As long as you keep it in the main backlog, accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
If you place it in some secret list, right?
Yes.
It's again, it's
gone.
It's a red flag. It's gone.
Yeah, it's a red flag.
As long as it's in the backlog, and you're planning to address it, and within the next sprint, it's okay.
Nice, makes sense. And in terms of, we talked about communication internally between colleagues in terms of getting that technical debt down, or at least trying to avoid it or minimize it. How, in terms of bringing users into the mix, we talk a lot about user involvement or user-centric design or user interviews or what have you, involving users in some sort of way. Is there any way to involve the users in the design process or in the product development process kind of helps to minimize this technical debt?
Yeah. Well, we already spoke about it quite a lot also in the previous episode. There are multiple ways to involve the users, right? Like, the benefit of it is that you end up with an application that is, as you said, not overly bloated with features. You end up with the features that are actually being used by your users.
Right.
And that's by itself, allows you to accumulate as technical debt as little as possible.
Exactly. That makes sense. So involving the users and figuring out exactly how are we going to build this thing, and maybe not just involving 1 or 2, but if you have the luxury of having multiple users or potential customers or whoever it might be, kind of scope these tasks a bit better, as you said initially too, with the features. Make sure we only build what we need, or maybe even a bit bit less than we need
Yeah.
initially. Okay.
It's not a bad approach, especially for early stage startups.
In terms of documentation, we talked about it a bit initially, but how do you see documentation, if you could add a bit more context to it, how do you see documentation play a role in all of this in terms of like an internal startup team?
Well, again, I think it's plays a big role, and again, it's something that allows designers and developers to be aligned on the process, right? So if we have documentation, let's say we picked one of these from component libraries.
Yeah, these UI kits.
One of these UI kits, and we have documentation in there already. So if designers follow that documentation and developers follow that documentation at the same time, you have like people working on the same page,
right?
And that alignment just helps to reduce errors in the development process, right?
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, you won't even have to ask those redundant questions anymore, because it's just in there documented for you. And there's a reference point for you, right? So you don't even have to ask some of the questions.
Hidden costs. We know of all the obvious costs of having technical debt, rewrites and restarting the whole front end or whatever it might be when you get to that certain point. But is there any sort of hidden costs with technical debt that is not quite obvious, maybe from the outside looking in?
Yeah, I think it's I think in my opinion, at least, one of the not very obvious causes is when you hire new developers, right?
Yes.
Takes time to onboard them, but like usually where the technical debt is accumulated is, them not being trained enough.
Exactly.
And then maybe spitting out poor code,
right?
And then you might have somebody to look over them, but again, it's not something that can be sustainably done, right, in the long term, right? So,
And on the other side, there's also even if you get like a senior profile in as a developer, the code might be in such a poor state that is difficult for him or her to kind of get into the code.
Yeah,
like there's so much
without like rewriting the whole thing.
Exactly. Like most people would probably want to do anyway, but it's just that's a huge hiring them and having them remain happy and like having them want to work at your startup. There's so many levels to the
definitely. That's why you
hiring.
Choose you see a lot of startups choosing senior developers, or seniors.
Yeah,
are not hiring juniors unless they have a solid foundation internally.
It can be scary, at least. Yeah,
I had an experience actually at my previous work. So we at some point we were working with a developer agency.
Yeah,
and they hired. They had some juniors working for them, and we discovered later on, after we got a new CTO, that the code that they were writing was in a very poor quality, because they were relying on juniors to write it for us.
It's a shame.
And so after he did that audit, it was just it was a big mess, apparently. The quality of the code, right?
That's a shame.
And the readability.
All the considerations that goes into writing a complex platform is the juniors are great, but and doesn't even have they're poorly. There's also seniors who could create that sort of issue, but the whole idea of that's where documentation and communication and better design choices comes into play too.
Yeah.
In terms of it's quite obvious, I think, but at least that's what we see with a lot of our startup clients when they've been working for a long time and they approach us and they want to do something about the UX and UI. They kind of quickly realize that they want to redo the whole front end. Like once we start designing things and when we start suggesting things or challenging things, and they quickly realize that if we want to do this and we want to do it quicker, instead of just rewriting the stuff we have, we need to start from the beginning. Such an expensive process and so many wasted resources that kind of goes to waste in that process.
Yeah, sometimes there's you can't really get away without having any rewrites, because obviously, ideally, you want to do everything perfectly from the get-go, but, sometimes you just need to prioritize the features, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We spoke before.
Yeah, move fast, break things.
So
it's part of it sometimes. To end this episode, to end this topic of technical debt, that is a startup killer, is there anything you would suggest for the listeners, for the founders, for the product owners, for the developers in smaller teams? Is there anything you would suggest them to do now to kind of enable them to succeed in the future without too much technical debt?
Yeah, well, I think we should just run it back and mention a few things we already spoke about. So I think it's important, again, to, if you're working on a product, it's important to pick a nice component library. And it's a very important choice. So pick something that, is future-proof enough, and you are certain that the components will be supported and updated going forward. I think also the important thing is to kind of start off from the design part and then take it to the development. Once you know how things should behave in the front end, and you don't have to be a designer for that. It's just that it can be a rough sketch, but as long as everybody knows how that feature should work,
right,
and everybody are aligned on the specs, then you can take it to the development process.
Makes sense. 2 good pieces of advice: UI kit and start in design.
And last one is trust your developers. If the files are piling up and if your code base requires some structural changes, some infrastructure changes, I think it's important to hear them out too, especially if you're not the technical person, right? Sometimes it's important to hear them out.
Okay, I think that gives everybody who's listening to this a good foundation to kind of take some of the feedback or some of the ideas and concepts we talked about and kind of apply them in their daily work to start chipping away at that technical debt they're building up. I think the last thing we need to say is thank you to Modestus for providing the great insights, and thank you to Felipe from the production side behind the cameras, making us look good. And I think Felipe mentioned one time or another that I have to plug that they have to leave 5 stars. Yes, you can leave 5 stars, but rate the show from 1 to 5. iTunes, Spotify, getting into that podcast mindset. I think that's it.